In a quiet Texas suburb, the kind where mailboxes lean the same polite way and the evenings taste like cut grass and sprinkler mist, a man named Elias Hart woke at the first smear of dawn and lay listening to the slow-breathing house. The air conditioner murmured in its steady way, a faithful old baritone beneath the cicadas that had not yet surrendered the night. Elias swung his legs out of bed, joints talking to him in the soft, irritated language they'd learned since he turned 62. He paused at the window and looked over the yard he still called a pasture out of habit. Though suburb had crept to his fence lines on 3 sides these past 10 years, new roofs flashing in the sun where scrub oaks used to lean, cul-de-sacs looping like cursive signatures where deer trails once threaded. Cedar Park had swallowed his edges bit by bit, but the middle of his acre still felt like the country if he squinted. A ramshackle hay shed, a chicken run, 2 raised beds waiting for fall greens, and the old mesquite that had survived everything from lightning to his younger mistakes with a chainsaw. He made coffee the same way he had since he was 19, and poured it into the same blue enamel mug with the chip on the rim. He ate toast standing up and read yesterday's paper because the habit mattered more than the news. When the first slice of sun found the porch rail, he stepped into his boots and out to the day with a list in his head. Tighten the sagging gate, check the soaker hose behind the tomatoes, add another strand of wire where the raccoons had been clever, scrape the algae off the horse trough, even though he hadn't had a horse in 12 years. The list was a comfort. Lists kept you ahead of trouble. He had learned that from weather and work, and from Elaine, who'd called him her careful man, and then left him with a silence he filled with lists so it wouldn't swallow him. The sound came as he crossed the yard, thin, needling, nothing like the rowdy gossip of the hens or the keening of a hawk. At first he thought it was a loose hinge, and he marked it for later without breaking stride. Then it came again, higher, the kind of sound that threads right into the soft place behind a sternum. Elias turned toward the hay shed and waited. The shed leaned like an old man reconsidering a step. In the shadow under the lowest crossbeam, something small moved. Elias stopped 10 feet away and let his eyes adjust. 3 small somethings, bundled tight as knotted twine, unwound into shapes with ears too large, legs too uncertain, spots like dappled shade on their coats. Kittens, he thought. And then the thought corrected itself inside him with a slow, electric certainty that ran from scalp to heel. Not kittens. Bobcat kittens. He had seen bobcats at a distance all his life, the flash of a short tail, the quick slink through cedar, the amber look that made you feel like you'd been catalogued and dismissed in the same instant. But never this close, never 3 of them, never on his property, as if they had arrived with the milk delivery. They were little as mittens and absurdly serious, each step a small decision, each look a test. One looked straight at him, ears flared, mouth open in an outraged squeak that pretended at bravery. Another tumbled over the first and landed in a tangle of hay twine. The third pressed itself to the shed wall and tried to be the shadow there. Elias did not move. He did not crouch or reach or speak. He let his breath be the only motion on his side of the world. Coyotes, he thought. Snakes. Heat. Cars. He thought of all the ordinary ways something small and alive gets unalived in Texas, and his hands wanted work, any work, to make the day less risky for these 3. But instinct is old and practical, and his instincts stepped him backward a foot at a time. If there were kittens, there was a mother. He let his eyes scan the border places, the seam where yard met scrub, the low shelf under the mesquite, the higher limb where he'd once seen a grey fox light as a sigh. He felt her before he saw her, the way a room changes when someone you love walks in behind you. Then she was there, 30 feet away at the edge of the yaupon, a pause made of muscle and breath and amber. She wasn't big as mountain lions were big, but she was the exact size of her life. Every pound used, no more than necessary. Her coat was dry grass and brindle bark, her tail a blunt brush that told you what she was, even if the rest didn't. She did not crouch to spring. She did not show her teeth. She watched him like a ledger, measuring whether the day could balance with both of them in it. He lowered his chin in the way a ranch dog had once taught him, the opposite of a stare, a humble angle that said, "I will mind my own business, ma'am." The kittens made the decision for all of them, wobbling toward open light as if the sun had been their first promised home. One swatted at a beetle and nearly toppled. Another discovered the thrill of his own tail and spun until he fell into his siblings. The third, smallest, ribby in a way the others were not, made a sound that punched straight through Elias's list and into some place that remembered the exact weight of a baby goat he'd once warmed back from the edge with a hairdryer held all night long. The mother bobcat's gaze did not waver. If she was a tremor, it did not show. But something in her stillness loosened, a consent as subtle as a sigh. Elias stepped back again, slow as dusk, and made for the porch. Inside, he washed his hands of nothing in particular and stood at the sink until his heart decided to believe his body was safe. He thought of calling the non-emergency line, then didn't. He thought of all the ways men interfere and name it help, and decided to see what the day offered before he moved anything warmer than a thought. He set the coffee on the porch rail and sat with the careful patience of a fisherman. The mother settled under the mesquite's lowest fan of leaves, half in, half out of shade. The kittens found work in everything: a dropped feather, a dry clod that pretended to be prey, and then stubbornly was not, the fascinating edges of each other. He named them without wanting to, names rising the way cedar smoke finds your hair and stays. The bold one wore a rusty cast to his fur and claimed the fence post as a personal mountain. Elias thought rust and the name fit. The shy one held the shadow as if it were a blanket, making his body narrow as a question mark whenever one of the others looked too long. That one, Shadow. The smallest moved like a wind-up thing, just a hair too fast for its own balance. Pip landed before Elias had even considered a second choice. The hens didn't love the new neighbors. Their objection filled the morning in outraged clucks, but they kept to their coop, a stout thing Elias had built after a raccoon had worked out the older model like a puzzle box. He went to them with a handful of scratch, murmured apologies he hoped they understood, and checked the latches twice. He could shift their run or hang more tin skirting this weekend if it came to that. He'd seen bobcats climb what they chose to climb. But a mother with young wasn't out to collect grievances. She wanted a safe corner and a string of good days. He could give her the corner. The good days belonged to weather and luck. The routine settled like dust. Dawn gave him the count: 3 heads, a mother, no notches missing. He learned the rhythms of their hunger and sleep the way he had once known his children's growth spurts, by the way shoes suddenly didn't. At first light, the kittens tumbled and wrestled, all violence and no malice, pouncing on the flicking shadows of leaves as if the tree itself had volunteered to be their teacher. Mid-morning, they vanished into the cool underspace beneath the shed, an excellent nursery as long as the heat stayed this side of cruel. The mother hunted when the day was nobody's business. Deep night, blue blur dusk, that last margin before morning when even the highway sounded tired. Elias didn't see her bring food, but he found the evidence sanitized by ants at the margins of the yard. A quail's wing, a mouse's tail, once the delicate bones of a rabbit's foot, like beads a child had dropped and forgotten. He kept his dogs away from the back completely, and they accepted the rule, because the tone of his voice said this was not a negotiation. Buddy sat on the laundry room threshold and made an inventory of size that might have sold better if he didn't wag his entire back end the moment Elias looked his way. It pained him to tell a creature built for running that the day's job was to lie down and be excellent at lying down. He promised them creek runs come fall when the air turned honest again, and because they trusted him to say nothing he didn't intend to do, they believed him, and so did he. On the 3rd day, he found prints at the edge of his tomato bed, small and careful, a diagram left by a teacher with patient chalk. He crouched and set his fingers beside them. The pads were round, the toes neat, no claw marks, because cats carry their claws like secrets. He smiled without choosing to, a foolish upturn that no one was there to see. He set up an old trail camera on the fence, angling it toward the shed and the mesquite, a little embarrassed by his own curiosity. That night, he scrolled through past seasons' footage. A fox with a vole limp in its mouth. Raccoons gloved like old-timey bankers. The neighbor's tabby fleeing some trouble it had probably started. He cleared the card and told himself he wanted to be prepared in case the situation changed in a way a man ought to know about quickly. The truth was plainer. He wanted to see the secret world that bloomed in his yard when his lamp was off and his body insisted on sleep. The footage in the morning felt like a contraband gift. The mother slid out of shadow, as if she'd been poured from it, her paws making no impression even in the camera's night vision grain. She stood at the edge of the yard and simply looked at the house a long time, a square of yellow where his kitchen window leaked light. Then she turned, and the world sharpened. The crouch elongated into a glide, the pause, the sudden strike into grass, the lift of her head with a field mouse neat in her mouth, the way she trotted with a careful jog that did not jostle her prize. Later, the kittens spilled into view, a spill the camera caught, and the world had surely invented for the joy of watching. Rust mounted the low stack of old cedar posts and threw his forelegs around something only he could see, a conqueror, triumphant on his hill. Shadow moved like water under the fence rail and stilled so completely that even the pixels seemed to hold their breath. Pip misjudged the width of the hay bale and tumbled off it, disappearing, then popping back up like a rubber ball. Elias let the footage loop twice, and then once again, because there were places in a morning that coffee could not reach and wonder could. The weather built the way Texas weather does, polite until it isn't. August threaded its heat through everything until even the shade felt like someone had placed a warm hand on your back and left it there. The ground cracked where it had once been soft, and the hens stood with their wings a little open, pages held away from a hot book. The kittens did their work earlier and later. The mother was a phantom, more felt than seen. Elias hauled a shallow tub to the far corner and set a large rock in the center as a perch, so nothing that couldn't swim would drown. He filled it in the evenings and told himself it was for the cardinals and the wrens and the mockingbird who had claimed the power line like a pulpit. He did not fool himself completely. He set a second trail camera on the tub because if you were going to lie to yourself about the why, you might as well be honest about the how. On the footage he watched the mother drink in a fashion more regal than anything else that had ever occurred on his property. She did not hurry. Her tongue was a metronome. She lifted her head and water silvered her chin for a moment before falling back into the bowl, and when she was finished, she placed a paw on the rock, like a woman setting a hand on a table to rise and left, her body sliding into the dark like the end of a sentence that did not need a period. It wasn't all charm. The gifts began, half things left where a man steps without looking. He learned to look. He learned the economy of a hose on strong and a shovel on easy, and the quick bury by the compost where nature's garbage service operated with enviable efficiency. Once he found a rat, intact and laid square on his porch mat. It was so precisely placed he almost called the police to report a cryptic message. He told the world, "All right, we're neighbors, but there's no need to get personal." He put that rat under the loquat, and the loquat said thank you. Next spring, with fruit sweet, he forgave the whole arrangement twice. The day the storm broke, summer like a plate came without warning. Which is to say, the weatherman had been warning for 3 days, and no one believed him until the sky turned the color of a bruise, and the wind began talking in a voice even men whose grandfathers had laughed at weather learned to heed. The first drops were enormous, exploratory, and then the rain committed all at once, a white sheet unpinned and thrown over the neighborhood in a single move. Elias ran to check the gutters and found them overwhelmed in seconds. The ditch at the back swelled from a sulky trickle to a brown rope, then to a brown river that pretended at purpose, and then proved it by taking a piece of his back fence that had been on his list and hadn't yet been near the top. He thought of the hens and bolted for the coop, shoulder-checking the door open against a wind that had decided doors were a misunderstanding. The hens panicked in the old broad-chested way of birds, and then remembered that the man with the feed also knows when to be calm, and they stilled. He checked locks and wire and wished them courage, as if that were a thing one person could give another in handfuls. When he stepped back out, the yard was a translation of itself into water and motion. The shed's footprint was dry by some miracle of grade, but the ditch had climbed its banks and stretched a tongue into the low part of the yard where the ground dipped like a saddle. That tongue licked at the mesquite's roots and thickened with every gust. Elias looked for the mother by instinct and didn't find her. He told himself she'd moved the kittens to the haven under the shed a half-hour ago, when the sky had made its intention known. Then he heard the sound over the rain, the particular distress of a small thing that knows its smallness better than anything else. He scanned the fence line and saw two shapes, Rust and Shadow, mired near the creeping water, their bodies low, their courage higher than the sense God gives to babies. Pip wasn't with them. Elias's chest did that old tightening, the body bracing for a thing before the mind can decide whether it's coming. Then the mother appeared out of the downpour, a streak, every motion underlined with urgency. She shoved the larger kittens upslope with her shoulder, her mouth opening and closing as if she was speaking in a language rain ate before it could reach the ear. Rust found grip and scuttled to the shed. Shadow followed with a dislike for the water that read as pure offense. The mother turned back, and Elias followed the line of her gaze and found the very small shape of Pip pressed against the far fence corner where the water drew a dark crease. The kitten's paws skittered on the mud. The ditch tongue lapped at her front legs, and she went flatter, plastering herself to chain link as if flatness could be a raft. Later, Elias would try to explain what happened next in a way that did not make him sound like a man who had decided to be reckless for the sake of a story. He would fail, because the truth was simple. He moved. He did not think or weigh. He grabbed the long cypress plank he'd been meaning to turn into a bench for the front porch and lifted it over his shoulder and went out into a rain that felt like the world was being scrubbed for some cleaner version of itself. He did not run because some part of him still listened to old rules about predators and posture, about haste and threat. He walked with purpose that tried not to be a threat at all. The mother saw him and did not leave. Her ears flicked back flat and then forward again. She looked at him as the ledger in her mind had found a column it had not accounted for and was now in the curious position of trusting arithmetic. He put the board down with a care he usually reserved for a saddle on a horse's back. He angled it from the high edge of the yard to the lip of the new creek the storm had invented. The board bounced on the froth and then steadied, a good bridge, pretending it had always meant to be there. He took 2 steps back, his hands open because he had once learned how to tell a nervous colt that he held no rope in them, and then had practiced that language on skittish boys, and once on a woman who had sat on their porch at 3 a.m. and told him a story that had emptied her of tears. The mother bobcat lowered her head to Pip and pushed, and Pip tried to climb an invisible thing and slid back into fear with a sound that made Elias's teeth hurt. He pointed to the plank as if she understood pointing. The mother looked at the board, then at him, then at the board again. She placed a paw on the plank and tested it with a weight that said she had not survived this long by believing in miracles offered by strangers. The board held. She stepped onto it, turned to face her kitten, and made a sound so low and certain that Elias felt it in the soles of his feet. Pip gathered herself into a ball, unspooled, and put one paw on the wood. The water licked at the board, and the board shrugged it off, and then Pip ran, a tiny clatter of claws that spelled out the alphabet of survival on wet wood. When she met the rise, the mother grabbed her by the scruff with a gentleness that made a mockery of all the ways humans misuse the word power, and carried her to the shed's dry mouth like a prize. Elias stepped back again because his body had learned a lesson he didn't have time to explain to his mind. The mother didn't follow him with her eyes this time. She didn't need to. The ledger had balanced. He lifted the plank when the worst had passed and set it aside and went inside, only because thunder makes a liar of men, and his house still had windows that leaked if the wind came from the east. He leaned his forehead against the cool of the kitchen door and let his body find out slowly that it had done a thing it was not entirely sure had been wise but would do again if the day asked. The storm broke in a petulant mutter and then was gone, leaving a world that smelled like pennies and damp bark. The ditch let go of his fence as if the two of them had never argued. The air rested on his skin like a damp shirt, and the yard took a long breath that sounded like a prayer spoken by someone who still remembered the old words. When the mother emerged, she was stillness again, as if the animal who had leapt into water was some other version of herself, kept in a back room and only brought out for emergencies. The kittens were very busy being alive with more intensity than they had ever had to practice before. They climbed close things and slapped at leaves and performed small, officious inspections of every inch of ground that was not under water anymore. Elias brought a towel outside and then laughed at himself and took it back in, because some gestures are for us, not for the ones we pretend to offer them to. He made toast, because toast is what you do after miracles. He ate it standing up, looking at the wet world, like a man who had been forgiven something he had not fully known he had done. After that, the line between the lives on his property thinned, as if a seam had been pressed and warmed until the two fabrics decided they could bear each other without chafing. The mother did not bolt when he walked across the yard at midday with a wheelbarrow. She watched him with the mild skepticism of a neighbor who has learned you will return borrowed tools on time. The kittens discovered the fascinations of his boots when he left them by the back step and rearranged the laces into a thesis about knots. He began to speak aloud when he saw them, not words meant to compel anything, just the ordinary narration people give their dogs and their babies, and the sink when the sink won't drain. All right there, Pip, mind your step. And that's taller than it looks, Rust. And I see you hiding, Shadow, but your tail gives you away, friend. He suspected the tone mattered more than the words, that kindness has a pitch to it even other hearts can hear. September brushed the edge of the days, taking the white glare down to a softer gold. The kittens lengthened, their spots ghosting into the pattern of grown things. Rust tested the boundary of the property with the conviction of a teenager who already knew how to come home late, just not why he should. Shadow became an artist of vanishing, a magician who, when found, looked as if he'd been there the whole time, and you had simply failed to look properly. Pip practiced her pounce until the pounce learned her weight, and the first time she caught a cricket, and then let it go, and then caught it again, she looked as startled by herself as Elias was proud for her. He watched their mother teach them with a curriculum written in the oldest ink. The crouch, the stillness, the patience that is not nothing but everything tucked in and held. He saw her refuse to bring food some nights, so the hunger would press them into their own attempts. He saw her let them fail, then let them try again with the unfairness of perfect love. On a Thursday morning that had the taste of fall, Deputy Alvarez from down the road knocked on his front door with a clipboard and the weary politeness of a man required to deliver a message he didn't write. "We've had calls, sir." Elias looked at the clipboard and at the deputy's sun-reddened neck and knew which house had called. The Buffett family kept their lawn like a haircut, and their opinions like mail they never stopped sorting. "Bobcats are protected under state law," Alvarez said, "and we don't relocate unless there's aggression or disease, which does not sound like the case here. I need to ask you to remove attractants, bird feeders, open compost, unsecured trash, to encourage the animals to move on when they're ready." Elias nodded. He had moved the feeders weeks ago, without telling himself why. He had secured the trash with a bungee that snapped back on his wrist every time, as if the can itself objected to the indignity. Alvarez scrubbed a hand over his face. "I'll be honest, Mr. Hart. You keep your dogs in. You keep your birds locked up. You don't try to pet nobody you shouldn't be petting. These folks will probably wander off once the youngsters get the hang of being teenagers. They like edges better than middles, if you know what I mean." Elias did. He signed the form like a truce. They left as fall decided to be serious. Rust first, on a morning the sky looked like clean cotton. He slipped under the lowest rail without a glance back, and then glanced back slyly from the second fence, over, in a way that let Elias pretend he'd been granted the courtesy of a goodbye. Shadow went a week later, so silently Elias only knew from the absence of the particular notch his paw made in damp soil beside the mesquite. Pip stayed longest, which suited Elias's selfish part and his cautious part both. The mother ranged wider and brought less. There were nights the camera caught only a breath of her, tail, shadow, the lacquered bright of eyes, and mornings where the tub sat without ripple and the ground told no stories at all. The day before Pip left, Elias sat on the back step with a slice of pear that begged to be eaten in shade. Pip materialized in the low arch between the shed supports and froze in a way that was not fear so much as attentiveness, every cell aware of itself and the world. Elias did not move. He held the pear slice and let the heat slick his knuckles. Pip made a small sound and took 3 steps toward him, and then 3 back, and looked at his hand as if the fruit were an argument she intended to counter. The mother came then, and placed herself between them with a stance that said thanks for the plank, and that is sufficient. Pip turned and bumped her shoulder against the mother's leg, and the mother looked at Elias, and he looked at her, and none of them moved, until the pear slice grew ridiculous in his palm, and he ate it, because there are certain ways to demonstrate you have no designs on anyone's child. Pip left 2 mornings later with the kind of bright dawn that makes promises it almost keeps. Elias didn't see her go. He knew from the way the yard held its breath and then released it, the way birdsongs returned to ordinary volumes, and the hens resumed their bureaucratic errands with renewed authority. He walked the fence line that day, like a man inspecting a thing he meant to sell, and found nothing but the absolute ordinariness of ground, without a secret in it. He sat on the step anyway, and watched the place where the shadow under the shed is darkest, and told himself, this is what you wanted, because wanting what's best for another thing, and wanting to keep it, are 2 wants that agree only in fairy tales. 2 weeks later, he found a feather on his doormat. It was grey, and not much of a feather by the standards of magazine birds, but it had arrived there as if delivered, placed with a care no wind had ever learned. He stood over it, with an expression he would have disowned if a neighbour had walked up his drive. He picked it up as if it were the corner of a letter from someone you loved who had run out of paper. He set it on the windowsill above the kitchen sink because some things are too important for drawers. The next night, the tub camera woke him with its chime, and he ignored it because some joys taste better in morning light. At dawn, he watched the clip, hands wrapped around his blue mug, as if the ceramic could return the favour of all the heat he'd poured into it over the years. The footage was short. A young bobcat padding in from the fence line, coat clean, spots a rumour. The left ear held the smallest extra nub of darker fur like an accent mark. Pip stood on the rock in the water bowl and drank as if the business of thirst and remedy were new and delightful. And then she turned toward the house and looked at the rectangle of kitchen light where he had once stood with a towel in his hands, and her mother had measured him as if he were math. The clip ended there because the battery died exactly then, which was precisely the sort of joke the world inserts into our best moments, so we remember not to want too much documentation. After that she came sometimes, and sometimes not. Elias would find the small crescents of her steps in the damp earth at the sump pump's outlet. He found twice, and then 3 times, the indentations in the mesquite's bark, where young claws had tested the old tree's patience. He did not tell anyone. Alvarez would have nodded and kept the secret like a man who knew the value of a quiet joy. The Buffetts would have suggested a homeowners association subcommittee. The hens would have clucked about the increased need for vigilance, and then stolen grapes from each other with undiminished glee. The dogs knew, of course. Buddy would nose the back door and wag his entire theology of forgiveness, and Elias would put a hand on his head and say maybe later, and mean both the walk and the next life where, if there is such a place, every longing arrives as a visitor and stays just long enough. Winter teased, then set its chair at the table. A north wind shaved the edges off afternoons and left mornings calm as a held breath. Elias spread straw in the coop and wrapped the faucet in old towels and duct tape in the way of men who are both thrifty and stubborn. He packed the trail cameras away, not because the story was over, but because some chapters ask to be reread in memory, where they do not have to contend with our clumsy need for replay. He matured into the version of a man who looks at his yard and sees not boundaries, but a ledger of favors traded between the human and the wild. He fixed the section of fence the storm had argued off his property and left a gap at the bottom large enough for a rabbit, then pretended not to notice the coyote, who had tested it anyway. He planted rye to keep the topsoil honest and told the hens they were appreciated in terms they could understand. More scratch, which is to say, more of absolutely everything. Once in a while, late, he would hear a sound on the fence as neat as punctuation. He'd go out the next morning and see the damp fingerprint of a paw on the top board, a blot that admitted nothing and confirmed everything. He never saw the mother again after the first hard frost, which is not to say she did not see him. He never saw Rust, except for a single feather lodged like a bookmark in the juniper on the far side of his yard, which he decided not to interpret because a man can only stand so many messages in a season. He saw shadow once in the corner of his eye, a ripple behind the neighbor's rock garden, and he did not turn his head because sometimes you can only keep a thing by refusing to chase it. When Christmas lights appeared on eaves up and down the street, and the air smelled like cinnamon from a candle you couldn't say you loved, but did anyway, Elias stood in his yard with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the mesquite. The sun went down. He stayed put. In the blue that comes after daylight shakes hands with evening and before night takes the whole room for itself, a shape appeared on the fence. Pip looked like a thought the yard had decided to have again. She did not jump down. She did not make a sound. She stood there long enough that the wind could count her whiskers, and then turned her head to where the water tub had been, and found it absent because he had brought it in against the freeze. He made a small involuntary apology that warmed the air, and then felt ridiculous, and then felt human. She looked at him, and he lifted his chin the way he had that first morning, and then lowered it in the old ranch dog language. "For I mean no bother, and I am happy you are here." She blinked once, the slow kind that reads like a secret handshake, and then she was gone into the kind of darkness that does not let even a man convince himself he saw what he wanted to. In spring, Rye greened the yard in a way that made the neighbors ask his advice, and he told them the truth, the cheap seed and the timing and the patience, and they thanked him, and then bought something more expensive because sometimes the price tag is our faith. He planted peppers and tomatoes and a row of zinnias for Elaine because she had always liked how they look like summer that can be picked. He rebuilt the plank into a bench and set it under the mesquite and sat there some evenings with nothing in his hands and nothing wrong enough in his life to fiddle with. He'd watch the yard being yard and the birds being birds and the fence being a line that things crossed because lines are like promises, important and also only human. He'd feel the old ache in his knuckles and the new one in his bones settle into a duet he could live with. He'd think sometimes how people scan the sky for wonders and miss the small ledger at their feet where a mother's trust and a man's plank become the whole parable anyone needs. He had been chosen by a bobcat to witness the classroom where the first lessons are always about not dying and the extra credit is learning to live. He had not failed the assignment. He had not aced it either, because only the wild gives A's, and it does so for reasons we don't get to ask about. He had shared his place and kept his dogs in and moved his feeders and given more water to more things than the city would say was frugal in a drought. In return, he had been given mornings that trembled with the knowledge that he was not the only one beginning again. He was given the long passing of a season and the shorter flicker of a paw on a fence, and the understanding that if you draw a map of where you live and do not include the roots of foxes and bobcats and the wild hunger of moths at the porch light, your map is technically correct and useless. Neighbors came and went. Children learned to ride bikes that sang when they skidded at dusk. A woman down the block taught her Labrador to ring a bell when he wanted to go out, and then regretted the ferocity with which he learned it. A man a street over grew a fig tree too near his fence, and lost exactly half his figs to the creatures who understood fence lines less legalistically than he did. Elias waved at them all and traded tomatoes for gossip and corrected nobody's ideas unless they asked him to. When people said, "I hear you had a bobcat back there," He would tilt his head as if reconsidering the word had. He would say, "I've got a mesquite older than me, and a ditch that thinks it's a river when it rains, and depending on who you are, that might be the same thing." Sometimes, if he woke at 2 with the old ache that has no clear cause, he would walk to the kitchen and stand at the window with his blue mug empty in his hands. The yard would hold its dark like a bowl holds water. He would wait without knowing what for. On some of those nights, a shape would appear at the fence and not move. He would not move either. The air between them would thin until it felt like the next breath might be something they shared. And in that precise small interval, he would understand the whole lesson again. That we are all tenants, even in places we deed to ourselves. And the best a person can do is to be the kind of neighbor whose ledger isn't all profit, whose kindness doesn't calculate interest, who keeps a plank handy because someday the water will rise and a bridge will be the only tool that matters. And then he would turn away because mystery without witness is sacred in a way the witnessed kind can't afford to be. And he would return to bed, and in the morning there might be a feather on the mat, careless and exact, and he would pick it up and set it on the sill beside the first one and think, "You made it, kid," and also, "Go on." And also, "Thank you for letting this little map of a yard include your roots for a while."